Beneath the crumbling archways of the Elder Fane, the stone ran slick with lichenous blood. Vara stood alone. She gripped the heavy, carved shaft of the obsidian glaive. Her lungs burned with every ragged breath. Her forearms trembled uncontrollably from 6 hours of unbroken, desperate combat. The metallic tang of copper filled the air, mixing heavily with the damp, earthy smell of ancient moss and crushed leaves. Behind her, deep within the pitch-black shadows of the inner sanctum, 50 lichenous refugees huddled together. They were a fragile collection of civilians, traumatized children, and trembling elders, clutching their knees in the dark. They fully expected to die tonight. Their culture demanded an honorable death in the ruins of their history. A rigid doctrine that insisted blood spilled on sacred ground was the highest glory a species could possibly achieve. It was the forbidden truth of their people that to flee, to seek survival over a holy and ancestral last stand, was a profound cultural sickness. Vara felt the crushing, suffocating weight of that taboo pressing down on her shoulders. She was supposed to embrace this violent end with open arms. She did not want to die. The line between a glorious sacrifice and a meaningless massacre is razor thin. Keep listening to find out which side of history Vara lands on. A guttural, echoing laugh. Vrel the Butcher stepped casually over the mangled bodies of her fallen comrades. The scaled host chieftain towered 3 feet above her. His heavy armor was a jagged, brutal landscape of dark metal and polished bone. He dragged a massive gravity mace across the uneven flagstones, kicking up a bright shower of sparks that illuminated his wide, predatory sneer. He mocked the pathetic frailty of her species. He spat directly onto the sacred ground, declaring loudly to his warriors that lichenous history would end tonight as nothing more than forgotten dust under his boots, which meant they were entirely out of time. Vara swung the heavy polearm with muscles that burned like they were flooded with battery acid, while the terrified whimpers of the survivors echoed off the pillars, and the scaled host warriors simply watched their leader prepare for the final slaughter. Vrel did not even bother to flinch. He simply shifted his stance and brought the humming gravity mace down in a crushing, unblockable arc. The weapons collided with a sound like a dying star. The ancient glass didn't just break. It sang a death rattle that had been 300 years in the making. The obsidian glaive shattered instantly into a blinding cloud of glittering, worthless dust. The raw kinetic force of the blow threw Vara violently backward into the dirt. She gasped for air that stubbornly refused to enter her paralyzed lungs. Her vision swam. Her fingers scrambled frantically in the loose soil. They found a single, jagged shard of the ancestral weapon. She gripped the broken glass tightly enough to slice her own palm open, using the sharp spike of pain to anchor herself to consciousness. She stared up at 12 heavily armored killers closing the circle around her. She had nothing left but a 6-inch piece of ceremonial debris. Defeat. But the sky suddenly screamed. When the galaxy pushes a desperate species to the absolute brink, the universe usually looks away. We will be right here to witness what falls from the dark. A massive, unnatural shadow blotted out the twin moons. Something heavy and metallic tore violently through the upper atmosphere, burning bright white with raw entry heat. It was a utilitarian drop pod. It did not attempt to decelerate. It cratered directly into the exact center of the forest clearing, throwing the combatants entirely off their feet. A punishing shockwave of displaced dirt, choking smoke, and white-hot ash washed over the ruins. Vara covered her face as a glowing scorch mark 50 feet wide permanently blackened the sacred courtyard. Her ears rang with a high, piercing whine. The scaled host warriors hissed in sudden confusion, raising their weapons toward the blinding heat of the smoking crater. The heavy steel doors of the pod blew outward with an explosive hiss of pressurized gas. A figure stepped through the rolling smoke. He wore no ceremonial crests, no bright colors, just matte black composite plating. This was Elias Thorne. He raised a heavy rifle. The air violently cracked. It was not the elegant hum of plasma. It was the concussive roar of a high-velocity kinetic slug tearing the sound barrier. Vara watched in numb shock as the charging scaled host warriors simply vanished. There was no duel. There was no exchange of names. The human weapon turned heavily armored zealots into red mist in fractions of a second. This was humanity's asymmetric doctrine in practice. Vrel roared, charging through the haze with his mace raised. Thorn did not shift his stance. A blue arc of a high-voltage neural pulse snapped from a secondary barrel. Vrel hit the dirt instantly, his nervous system paralyzed, his mouth frozen in a scream. 30 seconds later, the clearing was quiet. Heavy extraction landers descended. Vara sheathed her bone-handled knife, her chest tight with an unbearable shame. She was guiding the Lycanus children into an alien ship, violating the most sacred tenet of her people by choosing a comfortable survival over a holy extinction. The SSV Harbinger felt like a flying weapon. On the bridge, Thorn projected decrypted telemetry data across the primary monitors. The Archon deception was laid bare in mathematics. The Sovereignty had fed the scaled host false border coordinates, manipulating their ancestral hatred to orchestrate this suicidal invasion. Vrel's people were just expendable shock troops, meant to die softening the Lycanus defenses so the Archon fleets could claim the territory, which meant the holy rites were a lie. Thorn tapped a single command, Protocol Omega. Beyond the viewport, the empty space around the Lycanus homeworld suddenly shimmered. A massive, hidden human fleet dropped their stealth fields, materializing out of the void like steel leviathans. They did not wait for declarations of war. They bypassed the confused scaled host vanguard entirely and boarded their flagship, forcing a brutal, heavily armed parley to show the scaled emperor the Archon data. What followed was a 3-day massacre. The combined human and scaled host fleets turned their guns outward, ambushing the arriving Archon supply lines and annihilating them with cold, terrifying efficiency. Standing on the observation deck, watching the distant flashes of dying dreadnoughts, Vara finally understood. The Lycanus fought for honor, treating war as a spiritual performance. But these humans viewed violence as a mechanical failure of diplomacy. They possessed no romantic delusions about combat. Their power was a horrific, apocalyptic tool, justified only by its absolute necessity to shield the defenseless. How could such casual slaughter be considered a virtue? Because it kept children breathing. She walked down to the medical wing. Her surviving people were sleeping in clean, brightly lit bunks, receiving galactic standard trauma care from machines that hummed softly. She returned to the bridge. A jagged ancestral shard of the obsidian glaive rested on the edge of the holographic map table. It was no longer a symbol of a beautiful death, but a heavy, unyielding promise of tomorrow. Thorn leaned against the console, his armor heavily scarred from the boarding action, his eyes fixed on the burning debris field outside the thick glass. "They will send more," Thorn said, his voice flat and tired. Vara touched the sharp edge of the broken crystal, feeling a cold, unfamiliar dread settle deeply in her stomach at what her new allies were truly capable of. "Then we will let them burn."